Today's presentation is the introduction to the EnterpriseOne Orchestrator. My name is Jimmy Klisko. I'm the Excel Automation Advisor for Global Software. And today joining me is Larry Farino. Larry is the J.D. Edwards Practice Director here at Global Software. With over 12 years of consulting experience, he's managed and led numerous J.D. Edwards implementations, upgrades, and process improvement projects. Larry actually is the original author of Spreadsheet Writeback for the J.D. Edwards tool. Again, thanks for joining today for today's presentation. And so we will provide an overview of the EnterpriseOne Orchestrator and discuss the architecture of an orchestration. We'll also plan and design a new orchestration to add and update the financial data. And then we'll demonstrate how orchestrations are created using the Orchestrator Studio. So the next slide, just some quick facts on Global Software. We were founded in 1973. Our worldwide headquarters is in Raleigh, North Carolina. We have offices, sales and support offices in New York City as well as Seattle. We are global. We have offices located in London, in the UK, as well as Perth, Australia. Global Software and Spreadsheet Server, we are the #1 provider of Microsoft Excel-based automation solutions for the J.D. Edwards ERP marketplace, with over 5,000 supported customers in over 120 countries. Next slide. And speaking of customers, here's just a brief sampling of some of our customers on J.D. Edwards today. As you can see, we have Baxter, Ethan Allen, Alta Gas Utilities, as well as AMS, AudioBox, Port of Portland. And moving into the next slide, here at Global Software, our motto is start in Excel, stay in Excel. Spreadsheet Server is an Excel add-in that provides real-time reporting for J.D. Edwards. The huge time saver helps automate and streamline your current reporting process with J.D. Edwards. To the right, you can see Distribution Manager, which is also part of Spreadsheet Server. It provides an automated report distribution capability within Spreadsheet Server. It is part of the product. Also, at the bottom of the page, as you can see, Spreadsheet Writeback. This gives you the ability to write back to your J.D. Edwards system. At this point, I'm going to transition over to Larry. Larry's going to speak to the next slide, but I do want to encourage, if you have questions or comments throughout the presentation, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jimmy. Hi, everyone. So my name is Larry Farino, and as Jimmy said, I'm going to be walking you through the Orchestrator Studio today. We're going to plan and design an orchestration, and we're actually going to build one on the fly, and then we're going to test it with a couple of different tools. We're going to test it with the native Orchestrator client that comes with the Orchestrator, and we're also going to test it by loading data from Excel using the Spreadsheet Server Writeback. So we'll get to see a couple of different ways of how we can actually consume these orchestrations once we've created them. So I'm going to back up for a minute here and talk about a little bit of the history of the Orchestrator just for 2 minutes, because I think it's important to understand where it came from. So the Orchestrator originally was released in Tools Release 9.1.5.5. And in that very first iteration of the Orchestrator, it was actually called the IoT Orchestrator. So it was specifically meant for integrating Internet of Things device data. It was really a way for J.D. Edwards customers to build endpoints to receive data from IoT devices. And back when that first release came out, there was no Orchestrator Studio. All these orchestrations and other components of the orchestrations had to be built through XML files. So it was still a fairly technical process to create those. But now, as J.D. Edwards has shifted towards a citizen developer paradigm, the intent is to have business analysts be able to go in and create their own orchestrations. So in order to do that, to facilitate that, J.D. Edwards came out with the Orchestrator Studio. And the Orchestrator Studio came out in Tools Release 9.2.0.2. So that's really the recommended tools release, the recommended minimum tools release to be on in order to build and maintain these orchestrations, but certainly you can go back as far as the tools release 9.1.5.5. And just another note on that, you can be on a newer tools release with an older apps version. So you can be on J.D. Edwards apps 9.0, 9.1, or 9.2 and use the tools release in the 9.2s. And there's a lot of benefits to doing that. In addition to the orchestrations and the Orchestrator Studio, there are a lot of other benefits in those newer tools release. So I'd encourage you to check those out if you're not already on one of the 9.2 tools releases. In tools release 9.2.0.5, the Orchestrator Studio was significantly rewritten, made a lot more user-friendly. And they really just gave it a facelift to make it easier for the business analysts to go in and create their own tools releases. In tools release 9.2.1, the orchestrations were transitioned to UDOs, the user-defined objects. So they became treated just like your personal grids or your Cafe One screens or the E1 pages. So you can They follow that same SDLC and same security, starting with Tools 9.2.1. Then in Tools Release 9.2.1.4, we added a couple, or J.D. Edwards added a couple of new features, which I think are very important. They offered, I think the biggest one is they offered support for Groovy script. So Groovy script it's a more technical thing, but it allows you to enhance the orchestrations to start building custom logic in there. So the intent of the orchestrator was really to just receive simple data. But now with 9.2.1.4 and with Groovy, you can start building complex business logic. And that's the first release where I would consider it to be a true replacement for business services. You can really do just about anything with those Groovy scripts. The other thing that happened with 9.2.1.4 is that they rebranded it. So initially, when the Orchestrator came out, it was the IoT Orchestrator, and it was geared really for just IoT devices. But in 9.2.1.4, they changed it to the EnterpriseOne Orchestration because they realized that there was a lot of other use cases beyond just IoT devices, particularly for software integration. So I myself have written and used orchestrations to integrate data, certainly from Excel, which we'll see a little bit later today, but also from Salesforce and other third-party systems. So you can really use these orchestrations as an easy way to create integration endpoints into your J.D. Edwards system. And the nice thing about it, really, is that it gives you the full access to everything in J.D. Edwards, just like a user would have. So any screen that's in J.D. Edwards, custom or standard, you can create an orchestration against that. And you get all of the same benefits that a user would get. So if you send data to the orchestration and there's an issue with the data, the orchestration will give you back an error message that matches exactly what the user would see if they were entering that data in the screen. The other thing it does is, as you know, when you're on J.D. Edwards screen, if you're entering some of the data in there, J.D. Edwards will auto-populate some of the other fields. So for example, in real estate, if you enter the building and the unit associated with the lease, J.D. Edwards will automatically populate the square footage for you. Same thing with the orchestration, with the orchestrator. We can send an orchestration, the building and the unit. We don't have to specify the square footage, but because J.D. Edwards, or because the orchestrator works at the application level, any of those benefits at the application level that the user gets, we get. So the orchestration will automatically populate that square footage for us, as well as a number of other fields in the screen. Whatever fields are auto-populated, we will get that benefit from the orchestration as well. And the last thing that's really nice about the orchestrator is the security. So the orchestration inherits all of the user security, all of the application and row level security. So when you send data to an orchestration, you also send it your J.D. Edwards user credentials, just like you need to log into the web client. The orchestration passes those credentials on to the J.D. Edwards web server. in order to validate that you have access to create a new journal entry or approve a journal entry or whatever action the orchestration is trying to take. So we inherit all that security natively. Then the last thing that I want to touch on briefly is in this latest tools release, 9.2.2, JD Edwards also added notifications. Notifications is a big deal. I recently heard AJ Schifano from Oracle and JD Edwards talking about notifications, and he says this is the thing that's going to give your ERP system a heartbeat. What it does is it allows you to send messages to users of JD Edwards, whether they're on JD Edwards or not. So certainly we can integrate with the Work Center and send messages there, but we can also send messages via SMS, so we can send a text message, we can send email, and a variety of other ways. So we can really start integrating those notifications in. The other thing that it does is it allows you to start executing watch lists and trigger orchestrations, and probably most importantly is it allows you to create schedules. So you can put orchestrations on schedules and use this to start integrating data into JD Edwards on a scheduled basis. You don't have to actually manually trigger those things anymore. And so that functionality combined with notifications, I think, is a huge deal for the orchestration. And it also just kind of shows how much development JD Edwards is putting back into the tool, because they've made significant enhancements to the orchestrator, and it's totally different from when it first started, but in a very good way. There's a lot more functionality now. So I think that gives us a good high-level overview and background of the orchestrator. What I'm going to do is share my screen here, and we're gonna go into JD Edwards. Before we do that, Jimmy, are there any questions before I jump in and start getting into the orchestrator and JD?
Not yet, Larry.
Okay, excellent. Guys, just a reminder, as Jimmy said before, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat box. I'm happy to stop and pause, and Jimmy will interrupt me throughout the demonstration if we get any questions in here. I'm happy to make this as interactive as everybody wants. I'd much prefer to talk about the topics and functionality and answer the questions that you guys all have, as opposed to just kind of going through what we've scripted out here. So again, please feel free to jump in and ask questions, and you know, I'll pause throughout the conversation, but Jimmy, definitely please feel free to interrupt me if we get any in the chat box.
Will do.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's log into the orchestrator. The orchestrator sits on top of your AIS server, your application interface services. So if you don't have that already, it does require the AIS server to be set up for you. But once that's there, there's no additional licenses to running the Orchestrator Studio. It now became part of your standard tools release. And that first got introduced with the tools release 9.2.1.4 when I said that they rebranded it to the EnterpriseOne Orchestrator from the IoT Orchestrator. But it's true of all versions now. There's no separate license for this orchestrator. It's part of your tools release. So in the orchestrator, we initially started with 5 components. So we started with orchestration, service requests, cross-references, whitelist, and rules. And I mentioned that in this latest tools release, they added notifications. So I'm going to take a minute and talk about what each of these different components are and how they're used. And then we'll get in and actually design and test an orchestration. So the first thing, I'm going to hold off on the notifications for a minute. I think we did kind of touch on that and that functionality, but I want to really focus on these other 5. And specifically for today's demonstration, we're going to focus on the orchestrations and the service requests. So the orchestration is a master component, and the intent of the orchestration is to do 2 things. One, it defines all of the other supporting the subcomponents over here, so the service request, the cross-reference, the whitelist, and the rules. And it also defines the inputs. And now with these newer releases, it also helps you to modify the outputs from the orchestration. So the orchestration really does nothing more than define these other components and define the inputs. The next component that we have here is the service request. So the service request is the brains of the entire thing. There's a bunch of different types of service requests. For today, we're going to talk about form requests, which allow us, the way I always describe form requests they are like a test script for your system. So you specify what application to go into, what fields you want to populate, what buttons, row exits, whatever you want to push, and those all get stored in the service request. One of the other service requests besides the form request that's pretty nice is the data request. That allows you to pull data out of JD Edwards. So you can query any JD Edwards application or view with a data request, which again is just another type of service request. And you can do all your kind of aggregations in there. So you can do sums and max and mins and group bys and all that kind of stuff within your service request or within your data request. Cross-references. So this is kind of cool. Initially, this was done for the IoT use cases where we have a device ID which relates to a sensor, and we need to cross-reference that with an asset in JD Edwards. And this cross-reference would allow us to do that. So the orchestration would see the sensor ID, and then it would automatically transform it on the fly to the JD Edwards asset ID. For other use cases, though, it's becoming more relevant. So we had a customer that I spoke with recently, and they said, well, we want to have an address book orchestration, and we want to load all of our address book data from Excel, but really it's our third-party partners that are going to do that for us. And they don't know our JD Edwards address numbers, and they don't want to know it. And the solution was to incorporate a cross-reference into the orchestration. And that cross-reference, what it did is we stored the third-party partner's address number in that long address field on the address book, and we built a cross-reference dynamically in the orchestration. So whenever a new address was added, a new cross-reference was added as well. And then anytime we needed to update an address book record, the third-party provider, all they did was send their version of the address book number, and the cross-reference looked it up and mapped it over to the JD Edwards address book number on the fly without the third-party provider ever having to know what JD Edwards had provided. So that was a really cool use case and a really cool implementation of dynamic mapping that we're looking at incorporating into some of our orchestrations. Next, we have whitelists. So whitelists are used to identify it's really a security measure, and in a way it can be considered sort of redundant with cross-references, because if you have a cross-reference and it doesn't find an appropriate mapping, then nothing will happen. But whitelist really it really did come from the IoT roots of the orchestrator, and so it was meant to be able to put some security around which sensors and which devices were allowed to invoke certain orchestrations. The last component that we have here is the rules component. And this allows us to add some conditional logic. So before I had mentioned the addition of Groovy script, and that gave us the ability to add all sorts of other business logic, but that does require some technical resources to use. These rules have been out here since the first iteration of the orchestrator, and it allows us to very easily and graphically, visually create these conditional rules, this if-then logic. And so one of the use cases that we have is in our canned address book orchestration that we deliver. We can, on the fly, add customer master and vendor master record, but we don't want to add a vendor master record for a customer, and we don't want to add a customer master record for a vendor. And if we have an employee, we don't want to add either. So what we do is we build these rules into the orchestration, and so what the rule does is it checks and it says, okay, is the search type a C for customer? If it is, go ahead and call the service request to add a new customer. And the same thing with the vendor. We have a separate rule for the vendor. If the search type is a V, then go ahead and also add a new vendor. So in one step, you can very easily start chaining all of these different service requests together, and you can do it in a conditional type of way, right? So when we talk about the address book, there is a Z file, certainly, that you can use to import address book records, but it does one thing, or I guess it does two things. You can either insert or you can update an address book record, but it won't dynamically or automatically create the customer master or vendor master record for you, right? So with the orchestrator, we can chain multiple service requests together, and we can execute the creation of the address book, and then we can feed the results of that into subsequent service requests. So we create the address book, get the address book number that JD Edwards assigns, and then use that to create the customer master and vendor master record all in one step. So we don't have this iterative back and forth where we load an address book, figure out what address book number JD assigns, update our data in Excel, and then re-upload it. It's just, it's not the most efficient way. And so that's a good use case of why you might use an orchestration as opposed to some of the standard Z files. It just gives you a lot more flexibility, and it gives you the capabilities of adding all of these things in one shot. So I would say that this is an improvement over existing Z files, and it also fills the gap where Z files don't exist. So there are a lot of modules or a lot of custom applications that don't have Z files at all. And so you can easily just build an orchestration to point to any application, and it will, and you then have an integration that you can use to load data from any source, including Excel. So I think that gives us a pretty good overview of the orchestrator. What I want to do now is get into actually building an orchestration. So for today, I think what we'll do is we'll build a simple address book orchestration. So to show you how we're going to build that, we're going to log into JD Edwards, and whatever we do in our JD Edwards client, we're going to replicate the same thing in the orchestrator. So I start by logging into JD Edwards, and I'm going to navigate to the address book. So I go into FastPath and AB, and this drops us to our Work with Addresses screen. So the very first step that we need to do when we're going to create a service request to replicate this is we're going to click on the Help button and About, and we're going to record our application, our version, and our form. This is what uniquely identifies what screen we're on in JD Edwards, the combination of application, version, and form. And so now that we have these three pieces of information, I'm going to go into the orchestrator, we're going to go into the service request, and we're going to add this application, version, and form. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come in, I'm going to click Service Request. I'm going to click on Create New Service Request. And again, as I mentioned before, we're going to do the form request. The data request is the other thing that I mentioned before. Custom is if we want to rate custom Java or custom Groovy script and embed that in our orchestration. Again, this is a more technical thing that you know, we would need IT to give us some development resources for that. So that's sort of beyond the scope of what we're looking to cover here. But you can also create a message, a connector to either another AIS server or some other REST-based protocol. You can create connections here to those, and then a watch list as well. But we're going to focus on the form request. So I'm going to click on that. The first thing I'm going to do is give my service request a name. So I'm going to call it GSI AB, or I'll just call it Address Demo. And for my description, I'm just going to say, create a new address book record. And I'm going to click on Save. So now we have our shell of our service request, okay? And that takes care of this top piece. There are two areas as part of the service request. The top area here is the order of execution, and the bottom one is the available actions. So the order of execution allows us to reorder the steps that are taken within each service request, within each service request. And the available actions gives us the menu of things that we can do within a particular form. So we're going to start with our available actions. We're going to add the application that we just looked at, so P01012. I'm going to tab over here, and JD Edwards will look up our forms. And I believe we were on B, right? So W01012B, so I'm going to select that. And then my version was ZJDE0001. And that's really all I have to put. I'm going to click on this Load Form button, and it goes out, it looks up on the AIS server, it goes and says, okay, here's all of the buttons and more importantly, all of the other fields that exist on that screen. And if we go back into our JDE screen, everything that we see here, so every row menu, every button, every field up here in the top part of the screen, as well as the grid, they all exist here in the form request. Now, when we're going and adding a new address book record, all we really do on this screen is click this add button, right? So when I click on this add button, it brings us to a new screen. So I'm going to replicate that same action here in our form request. I'm finding our add button underneath our buttons and exits. And when I click on this add action, you'll see it sends it upstairs here to our order of execution. And that's it. That's all we do on that first form. So now if we came to the service request, all it would do is click on that add button, which is a necessary thing for us to do, but certainly that doesn't give us the full picture of adding an address book record. So when we click on add, it creates a new, it brings up a new form. So same application, so P01012, same version, ZJDE0001. But it gives us, it's a different form. It's W01012A this time instead of B. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to leave my application the same. I'm going to change my form to an A. The version is the same. And now if I click on this load form, it will load that form again. But before we do that, I need to talk about these two other checkboxes at the top, particularly this application stack. So what the application stack does is it maintains a session across multiple form requests. So in this case, we're clicking the add button, and then we want the results of that add button to be the next step in our service request. So in order to do that, I'm going to click on this application stack. So now it's chaining those actions together. If I didn't have this checked, it would try to do these two form requests independently. So first it would click on add, and then it would just automatically jump to the next screen without going from that first original screen. So because we want that session to be maintained over both calls, we're going to leave this application stack on. The other thing that we have here is this bypass form processing. I'm going to check it, although it's not necessary for this particular use case, but this bypass form processing, what it does is it skips the event rules that are associated with loading a form. So there could be certain fields that are enabled or disabled when you load a form, and so by clicking this bypass form processing, it allows us to skip those checks. And the last thing we have here is a form mode. We have blank, we have add, update, or inquiry, and it does kind of what it says. It brings back the controls that are associated with adding a record, updating a record, or inquiring on a record. And what this does is really hide or show different fields in our available actions. I've had some issues working with that in the past, so my default is to always leave this blank because blank tends to give me all of the fields. So everything that I need is usually there when the form mode is blank. But if we need to, if a field's missing or we run into issues with that, then we can always circle back and change the form mode when and reload the form. So now that I have our application stack checked and our next application specified here, I'm going to go ahead and click on this load form. So I click on load form, and you see a new form request was added here in our available actions. Now, in the address book, if we're going to go and create a new record, we need to add an alpha name and a search type, right? Those are the two required fields that are needed to create an address book record. So I'm going to add those first. I'm going to scroll down here, and you'll notice that they're in alphabetical order. So we're going to put in an alpha name, and I will send this upstairs, and we're going to put in a search type. So here we go. So search type, and I'm going to send that upstairs. And really at this point, the only thing I would need to do is, besides an alpha name and a search type, is click on this OK button. And if I do that, then I'm done and an address book record will be created. But before we do that, I want to add a couple of other fields here. So let's add our address line. So we'll do address line 1, and we'll do all 4 of them here, and then maybe we'll do a city, a state, and a zip. and that will give us a representative address. Whoops. So I added 2 first, then I added 1, 3, and then 4. And I did that intentionally because I want to go back and show you the order of execution later. We can change those around so that it falls in order. But now that we have our 4 address lines, let's go and add our city. So we're going to add our city, and we're just going to call it city. Next will be our state, which is right here. So I'm going to just call it state. And I'm going to add my action up to the top. And the last thing is our zip code, which is called the postal code on the screen. So I'll call it zip code here, and then we'll send it to the top. Now the only thing that we're missing is that OK button. So let me go ahead. I'm going to expand my buttons and exits here. I'm going to find OK. And then I'm going to add the OK back up to the top. OK, so now that we have our service request laid out here, we're really ready to go ahead and incorporate this into an orchestration. But before we do that, I mentioned before, oh, my address line 1 didn't come in here at all. So actually, let me go back here and I'll add that. And so here's my address line 1. I'll add that. And so now my address line 1 is at the bottom, right? But really, I need this to definitely be before the OK button. So if I put this up here, now my address line 1 is before the OK, and it would get populated when we send the data to the orchestration. But really, it would look nicer if we had it going right above address line 2, so it was in order. So I'm just keep clicking these up and down arrows, and it allows us to reposition our actions. So now you can see address line 1 is right at the top. So you can move them up and down, and the X is, of course, to delete them. The other thing, before I close our service request here, is we've been specifying map values. So these are things that are coming in from the orchestration. If we wanted to give something a default value, so say, for example, instead of allowing the user to specify a search type, we wanted all the search types to always be E for employee, what we could do is take out this search type field and just put an E in here. And now, if we saved it like this, every single record would be given a search type of E. So any data that we want to set ourselves, that's how you do it. You populate this this default value field. So we have our map value, our default values. This plus sign here is for text substitution. So this is if we want to kind of mix default values and map values, you can click this plus sign and get into that. Just due to the time constraints today, I'm going to skip over that for right now, but certainly you can mix mapped and default values together and create a string on the fly. We have our ID over here. This corresponds to the AIS ID. And very quickly, if we come back over here into JD Edwards, if we click on our F1 and get our item help, you'll see we have all of our item help here. If I click on advanced options, come down here, we have an AIS ID of 36. That's what corresponds to that AIS ID in the studio. So that's sort of the key behind the scenes between the field. You don't need to know that. Everything is now, you know, it's linked through the descriptions. You can use that to build your orchestrations. But in the original versions of the orchestrator, you had to use these AIS IDs to do all of that. And still, if you wanted to export these orchestrations are portable, so you can export and import them. And what you do is you're exporting and importing XML files. And those XML files will have these AIS IDs in there.
Hey, Larry?
Yes.
Hi, Larry. This is Jimmy. We do have one question. Question from the audience is, how do you activate the orchestrator?
I'm sorry? How do you what?
How do you activate the orchestrator?
How do you activate the orchestrator? Okay. So the orchestrator itself is something that comes with AIS. So once you install AIS, the orchestrator is there. In the newer version, so since starting with tools release 9.2.1, the orchestration became UDOs, and that kind of requires you, actually really since 9.2.0.2, to get the Orchestrator Studio, you have to install that on a separate ADF server. Again, there's no additional license, but the Orchestrator Studio you install on a separate ADF server, and the Orchestrator itself is part of the AIS server. Great question.
Thanks, Larry. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so, okay, version, form mode, we talked about those. Those are just coming from our form request that we had up there. The return value, this allows you to specify which fields we want to return at the end. So, for example, actually, let me go out of this for a second. In our case, if we want to return the alpha name, I'm going to click on this checkbox for alpha name, and now in the return screen, you'll see that there's a return form ID of 28, and there's no form ID name, but I'm just going to call this alpha name. And now when we get our return values from the orchestrator, it'll show that to us. And then lastly, what we have over here, you notice once I check this off, this box became editable. What this box does is it allows you to give it a variable name, which you can use in future orchestration. So for example, when we were talking about dynamically creating those customer and vendor master records, we need the address number that JD Edwards assigned to it. So if we go and we return the address number, we will get, we'll be able to use that in future orchestrations, and the way we do that is with whatever variable name we give it here. And then of course we already talked about this add action button. That's what sends it to the order of execution. So at this point, our service request is looking pretty good. I'd say we've got that complete. So I'm going to exit out of my service request, and I'm going to go create an orchestration that calls the service request. So come back here, I click on orchestration. We're going to click on new orchestration, and I'm going to call this GSI address demo. And it doesn't have to have the same name. In fact, it's good practice to include the orchestration component. So normally you might do something like this, like GSI orchestration, ORCH for orchestration, and then what the orchestration is, so address demo. And I'm going to say orchestration to create a new address book record. Okay, so just a brief description there. If you want to give a longer description, you can click on this long description button, and it is virtually limitless, I think, in terms of what you can put. So if you have different notes or any kind of things that you want to be able to provide for future people that need to maintain the orchestrations, you would put it in there. This is something that the end users would see. So this description is usually a little bit shorter and just kind of gives you the overview of what it is. The long description gives you a lot more detail about how the orchestration is constructed. So I'm going to click on Save here, and on this screen now, you see that we have three different sections: the orchestration step, our input, and our transformation. So for the orchestration step, I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to click on Service Request, because that's the type of orchestration step that I want to do. You'll notice that there's cross-reference, there's rule, and there's whitelist. There's no notifications because that's another master component, like the orchestration component, but these four can be used in the orchestration. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and now we have a spot here for our service request. So now what I need to do is select the service request, and I'm going to pick, of course, the service request that we just created, this GSI address demo. So I click on that, and you'll notice that on the right-hand side, it gives us a whole bunch of rows, and it does that automatically. On the left-hand side, it gives us these two, our user address book name and our user address book number. But we need to really define all the other inputs. And the reason why we need to define these separately here is because each of these components can be reused. So for now, what I'm going to do is create, I'm going to create all of these with the same name as what we define them in the service request. So we have alpha name, we have search type, we have address line 1, and then let me let me copy this and I'll create the other. So that's 2, 3, and address line 4. And then let's just put in our city, state, and our zip. City, state, and zip. Okay, before we use these, we're going to go and define the type. So the alpha name is a string of characters, same with the search type. Really the same with all of these except for the zip code. That is that can be a numeric, although we can leave it as a string too because we can have dashes in the zip code. So we'll just leave them all as strings, that's fine. The other thing to note besides the string and numeric is that we have the dates, and the dates are just here in different formats. So depending on what kind of date format you're going to input the data, that's what you would select here. But I'm going to click string. So they're all here. We can override the default values in the orchestration for any of these. So if the input is not specified, we can assign a default value to any of these. But now we have to go and assign these orchestration inputs to the service request input. So the alpha name is mapped to alpha name. Now, I can sit here and go through all of these, and it's fine because we have just a small group of these inputs. But if we had, 30 fields that we were doing, it would get pretty tedious, especially, well, it would just get hard if there's a lot of names there. So what I'm going to do is, next to this transformations button, there's this auto map. If I click on this, it's automatically going to populate the orchestration input fields to match up with the service request input fields. And it only does that if they're spelled exactly the same. So if I took like a space out of here, if this was address line 1 without the space, it wouldn't be able to auto map it here. And again, you can change your default values that get sent in for the service request over here. And again, the reason why there's this sort of redundancy between defining the inputs at the orchestration level and at the service request level is because you can reuse these inputs and they can be used, or these service requests, and they can be used for different things. So you can have one service request and you can use it in 10 different orchestrations. And those orchestrations can each call multiple different service requests. So because of that, your orchestration inputs are going to be a superset of all of your inputs for each service request. So at this point, our orchestration is complete. I'm going to click on Save. And so our orchestration should be saved. And we can actually go ahead and call this now. So the first way I'm going to call it is by looking at the Orchestrator client. Let's see. Let me log out and log back in here and make sure that's okay. So you'll notice if I click on this, this orchestration list, our orchestration isn't there yet, and that's because the orchestrations are cached. So I'm going to click on this XML cache refresh button. Now it says everything's been cleared, and when I click on this, I should see our address demo, and here it is. It's our GSI org address demo. So I click on this, all of our fields show up, and I'm going to call this Larry GSI demo 1. We'll give it a search type of E, and I'll just call this ABC Street. And maybe it's in Denver, and it's in Colorado. And so I go ahead and I run this, and sure enough, it's here. It doesn't look like there's any errors. We got our name back here. So let's go check and see how this got into JD Edwards, right? So let's go look for our address book record. I'm going to click on here, and I'm going to call it. I'm going to search for, what did I call this? Larry GSI demo 1. So Larry GSI demo 1. Or let's just call it demo. So if I click on this, I should see our one record. Here it is. And if we go to the mailing address, here's our ABC Street, Denver, Colorado. Perfect. And one thing you'll notice with the Orchestrator client, two things actually. One, you can only do one record at a time, so that's not very helpful. It'd be really great if we could load 10 of them, or 100 of them, or 1,000 of them, or however many we need. So I'm gonna show you how we can do that next. The other thing is the output here. So this output is kind of ugly, right? It's got a whole bunch of technical stuff. Really, all I care about is the title of my address book record. So this Larry GSI Demo 1, that's really all I want to see. So I'm going to come back to the orchestration. If I click on this orchestration output button, it allows me to manipulate that output. So I'm going to click on Add All. We only have the alpha name. But now if I click on this preview, you'll see it only shows whatever this alpha name is going to be. So that's exactly what we wanted. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to save this orchestration again. I'll refresh the cache one more time. And now let's call this, oops, is that, okay, let's try this here. So let's call this Larry GSI Demo 2. If I click on Run, you'll notice that the output now has just the alpha name. And certainly if I come back here to my work with addresses, click on Find, here's my Demo 2. And it should have all the same information inside of it. So the intent of the Orchestrator client is really not meant to use it in any kind of a production environment. It's really meant to just be a quick and dirty way of testing your orchestrations. So let's look at a better way of doing this. Let's look at loading these things from Excel. So I'm going to come into our Excel add-in here, and when I click on Select Orchestration, it's going to make that request out to the AIS server, and it's going to look at all the orchestrations that we have created. So if I go and look at, hold on, let me make sure I've logged in. I didn't see it there. So here's where I'm logging in with my connection information. So it's showing me the orchestrations for my user ID. And here it is. Here, I must have missed it before. So here's our GSI org address demo. And you'll notice here, this is the description that we had put in, right? So orchestrations create a new address book record. I click on Save, and it paints this template for us with all of the information that's needed. So I'm going to come out here, and I'm going to enter some data here in Excel. So Larry GSI Demo 3. I think that's what we had called it before, right? Let me just go back and check here. Larry GSI Demo 1. So yeah, so we're up to 3. So 3. Let's create 5 of these records. So we'll create 4, 5, 6, and 7. We'll give them some different search types. So we'll make a customer, we'll make a tenant, we'll make a vendor, we'll make an employee, and we'll make a Z. Z doesn't exist, so I just want to show what those error messages look like and how we can get them. So for the address, I'll put in 123 ABC Street, attention GSI. We can make this Denver, Colorado. Okay, so I'll copy these down. And now we have our data that's ready to go. We're just going to click on Load Data. Click on Yes. Little progress bar will show up here at the bottom and shows you how many have been loaded. So our 5 records got loaded. And here's our return ID. So we see the alpha name that got created. We could have the address number here as well, and it will return that address number to us. We also have the warnings and errors that get returned. So this warning message is for on our T record. We just get a customer vendor master warning here saying that they have to be specified. And that's in order to collect rent from tenants and to return security deposits. That's why we need those AR and AP customer and vendor master records. But here's the one that's really interesting. So the search type of Z, we knew that wasn't going to get in. But look at what the error message tells us. It tells us that Z is not found in user-defined code 01ST, and that's exactly what we would need, right? We would need to say, okay, this search type, this is the one that's missing here, and what we need to do is either go change our search type on the Excel data or go into JD Edwards and add a new search type into our user-defined code table 01ST. So it's pretty good error messaging that we're getting back from there. But let's go jump back into JD AdWords. Let's go take a look, and we'll see, we'll verify that all of these got created. So I'm going to come back here. I'll click on Find again, and sure enough, here they are. So here's our demos 3, 4, 5, and 6, and certainly 7 didn't get created because we had the error message there. And if we drill into any of these, we'll see very quickly that that we have all of our address data specified exactly the way we had it in Excel. So you can see it's pretty easy. We've created the orchestration. We come in here, and now we can load any of that the data from Excel into any orchestration. By way of background, I'm going to just take a quick look here. I'm going to show you guys. We have a bunch of canned orchestrations that we deliver with our spreadsheet server write back product. So that's the product that allows us to upload this data from Excel. But we have orchestrations in a lot of modules in JD AdWords. So certainly Address Book, which we just saw a preliminary version of it. But hopefully you guys can see how easy it is to extend those. So if we want to start adding category codes and any of those other fields that exist, it's very easy to do. In fact, here's our canned orchestration. If I go and click on that, you'll see we have a lot more fields here. So you can specify the address number if you want, or let JD AdWords assign it. Either one will work fine. We have our address information, but we also have like SIC codes, parent person court numbers, and some category codes. All of this stuff exists. And then even at the end, we have our payment terms for our customer and vendor master records. So that's one of our canned orchestrations. But we have it for journal entries, for loading budgets, both at the detailed monthly budget level or at the summarized, requested, approved, or final budgets. We have, you can create vouchers, invoices. So we have those for AP and AR. For fixed assets, we can load assets and change the default depreciation rules on the loaded assets. We have things in procurement, sales order entry, real estate. Certainly we have a whole bunch of things for loading leases. That's a great use case where there is no Z file. So you can use this to load leases. You can create orchestrations against anything really, and again, even you can create them against your custom applications because the orchestrator does work at that application level. And as we saw here in the orchestrator, when you're going and you're looking at a service request, as long as you put in a valid application form and version, it will allow you to create service requests against that. So I know this was a lot in a short amount of time. I'll pause for a second, Jimmy, and we can see if there's any questions. If not, I can take the last 5 minutes and walk through some of the intricacies about adding rules and other things like that to the orchestration.
Larry, we do have another question from the audience.
Okay, great.
Yeah, the question is the Excel add-in part of JD AdWords Orchestrator?
Great question. So the Excel add-in is not part of the JD AdWords Orchestrator. That's an add-on that we created here at Spreadsheet Server. So that's our write-back tool. And really what it does is it leverages all of the power of the orchestrator to basically what we do is we package all the data in Excel and we send it to the orchestrations that have been built. But as part of that write-back product, we provide a whole bunch of canned orchestrations as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Not at this time.
Okay. All right. So we've got, I see about 7 minutes left. What I'd like to do is just very quickly go over what one of these orchestrations looks like for, in fact, I'll go through that adding of the address book record. So if I click in here, you can see this orchestration already looks a lot more complex. So the orchestration that we created before was this one, and it has an orchestration with one service request, right? The one to create those customer and vendor master records has a bit more going on. It has our same orchestration, and this form request, this is really exactly what we built, just with some of those additional fields. but you'll notice that there's 4 other boxes here. So we have a rule to test if it's a customer or a vendor, and then we have a service request to add the corresponding vendor or customer master record. So I'll just take a minute and show you what this looks like. If we come in here and edit the orchestration, the input and the transformation looks pretty much the same as what we saw before, but the orchestration steps look a little different now. So we have our first form request, and this is exactly the same as what we built earlier in the demonstration, but we also have 2 rules, and each rule has a subsequent form request. So let's take a quick look at these rules. So the first rule is GSI rule vendor test, and then we also have a customer test. So let's just take a quick look at what those look like as rules. Come over here, and here's our vendor test rule. And you can see it's pretty straightforward. We're just testing. First thing we have, of course, our name and a description, and our match value. We have match any or match all, and for our technical people, this is a logical and or a logical or. So match any means if any of the conditions are true, then the rule will evaluate the true, and match all means all the conditions must be true for it to evaluate the true. And if any one of them is not true, then it'll evaluate the false. And we're checking the search type, and if the search type is equal to T, then it'll evaluate the true, or, because it's match any, or if it's equal to V, it'll evaluate the true. So that's our vendor rule. And then our customer rule, it looks exactly the same thing, except that instead of V, it's a C. So if it's a T for tenant or C for customer, it will evaluate as true. And that's it. That's as simple as these rules are. This is the entire rule. And the thing that's nice about these rules is, unlike with the service requests or the orchestrations where you have to browse and then drill into them, your actual work for the rule is on the same screen, so you can toggle back and forth between different rules very quickly. Okay, so we've seen our rules. We know how the service requests are built. I'm just going to come back into this orchestration for one more minute. And you'll notice that for each rule, we have a subsequent form request, and it's indented. And you'll notice that in this action, it says true. And this means that this form request only gets executed if the rule evaluates the true. So what this does is the orchestration first does our service request to add our address book record. Then it comes in and it evaluates this rule and it tests if it's a vendor or a tenant. And if it's true, it will go and execute this next form request, which is the add vendor form request. And really what this looks like is exactly like what our address book orchestration or our address book service request looks like. It's just that it's pointing to the vendor master application and populating those fields instead of our address book fields. And then we do the exact same thing for our customer. So our customer test rule, and then then we'll go in and actually add a customer. So we covered a lot of information. I hope this was helpful for everyone. If you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I'm going to come back here and share my PowerPoint presentation. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to reach out to Jimmy. He'll be happy to answer them or collaborate with me, and we'll get an answer back to anyone. If anyone wants a more in-depth demo of the Orchestrator or in particular the spreadsheet server write-back tool, please definitely reach out. We're happy to give customized demos and show specific orchestrations and writing back data from Excel to really any screen in JD Edwards. So, Jimmy, with that, I can pass it back to you to wrap up, unless there are any other questions.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Everyone, that brings us to that brings us to the end of today's presentation. Thanks again for attending today. A lot of great questions. If you would like to learn more, my contact information is on the screen. My number is 602-321-0688. And my email address is jimmy.klitschko@globalsoftwareinc.com. Again, thanks for everyone's time, and have a great day.